to go ahead and move to our next presenter. Our next presenter is Gilbrian Stoy, a Roman Catholic priest in the Congregation of Holy Cross and a graduate student in Christian ethics at the University of Oxford. The title of his presentation this morning is A Cornerstone Rejected, Cistercian Architecture as a Model for Integrated Ecology. Go ahead, Gilbrian.
Thank you so much. I'll also just dive right in. Let's begin with something so common it is surprisingly unsurprising. Many of us gathered virtually for this conference come from all across the country, even across the globe. And yet if a conference attendee from New York or Atlanta or Los Angeles or Indianapolis or Denver were to drive to a suburb or look on Zillow for listings, they would find what appears to be the same house for sale as in the other cities listed above. In fact, one might find the same home in almost any suburb across the United States. There may be a number of influences. Housing shows, as one finds on HGTV, have a national reach and give national reach to a certain stylistic taste. An increasingly mobile middle class, which can afford to live in the suburbs, is increasingly mobile and desires some semblance of familiar wherever their corporate ties may bring them. We can imagine a number of other factors, but what is surprisingly not an influence on these designs is the climate in which the home is planted. New York, Los Angeles, Denver all have significantly different weather patterns, yearly temperature averages, and humidities, and yet little attention is given to the particularities of the particular place in which these homes are housed. As we gather to discuss rootedness, perhaps we ought to also attend to the roots, the foundations, the structures in which we develop social roots. I would like to do so in two parts. First, the theological ramifications of rootless architecture. Second, a look to a Christian architectural tradition that emphasizes place as a theological account of architecture, which can be a move towards redemption of the world, of the natural world. So I've listed some social factors that influence the consumerist desire for familiar architecture. But consumer desire is an insufficient explanation to the causes of this phenomena. Such building projects cannot materialize unless those who desire it also have the power and wealth to make it so. Traditional and vernacular architecture in hot climates typically have tall, in Rome 15 feet, in Brazil 12 feet, ceilings so as to get hot air away from the lower spaces that we occupy. Conversely, traditional vernacular rooms in cold climates tend to have low ceilings and small walls in order to contain heat, which was expensive. As the famed architect Vitruvius wrote, "These are properly designed when due regard is had to the country and climate in which they are erected. For the method of building which is suited to Egypt would be improper in Spain. So in other parts of the world, a style suitable to one climate would be very unsuitable to another." However, modern technology has changed what is possible. Central heating and air conditioning have given us the power to control temperature without concern for external conditions. The unimaginable wealth production of the 20th century has given us the means to enact that control with abandon. Seen most explicitly in the so-called McMansions of the early 2000s, which architect Kate Wagner has consistently critiqued for the immense cost of heating and cooling these homes. It could be said that this power and wealth have allowed humanity to transcend the particular climates we unfortunately find ourselves in, allowing us to take a first step towards what might later be some metaverse of freedom from the material world. But it's not the case that we transcend these particularities. The relationship between the human and the natural world is not at its center a Gnostic desire to transcend the body, to transcend the material and the particular in order to attain the liberty of immaterial spirits or souls. We are still embodied even in our temperature-controlled homes, and we still care about the comfort of our bodies. But now we have control. It's a form of dominion, of power over the material world, as if a fulfillment of God's command to subdue the earth. We subdue our homes one Mitsubishi air conditioner at a time. Pope Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si, describes this as a distorted version of our vocation to be co-creators with God. His argument is not a rejection of technology, not some Luddite version of rebellion. Rather, he claims that technology functions as a magnifier, revealing aspects of our desires which we might not otherwise notice. The world around us becomes a mirror of our own hearts as we shape it according to our desires. And nature no longer bears the image of its creator, the Imago Dei, but instead our own image. As Pope Francis writes, Once the human being declares independence from reality and behaves with absolute dominion, the very foundations of our life begin to crumble. For instead of carrying out our role as cooperators with God and the work of creation, we set ourselves up in place of God and thus end up provoking a rebellion on the part of nature. We can see in this citation a clear Augustinian influence on Catholic ecological imagination. Augustine considered the inescapable human condition after the fall to be a distorted heart, turned in on itself instead of ordered towards the divine. Humanity is marked by the desire to be like gods, to create in our image, whereas the Augustinian scholar John Cavadini describes, pride or suburbia is marked by the desire to have reality on one's own terms, as though one were God, as though one were the center of the universe and the source of all value. Architecture built by humans enmeshed in Augustinian pride become physical witnesses of that condition. It reveals through bricks and glass how we understand our relationship to creation. And so architecture is a theological resource, because within these spaces we enact or fail to enact theological realities. To imagine how architecture might witness to a different reality, we might turn to the past to recover a different way of rooting our buildings in place. Throughout Christian history, there are many examples of abundant wealth and power. Likewise, there are many examples of reform and reaction against that power and wealth. While some examples may further our own contemporary issues or reflect on contemporary issues, I want to focus on the 12th century reforms of the Benedictine tradition, which offers a catalyst to reimagine how architecture functions as a bridge for our relationship to the created world. The Cistercian order is a Catholic religious community which separated from Benedictines in order to form a new community with a renewed commitment to religious life. As often occurs, religious life had become stagnant, wealthy, and even luxurious, as seen in immensely powerful and wealthy Benedictine abbeys of Cluny, which was in modern-day France. This order built its abbey according to its communal identity. In reaction against it, the Cistercians built simple, functional, unadorned abbeys in contradistinction from the likes of Cluny. As historian George Dubey describes, Cistercian architecture is a monument of applied theology. The order embodied its belief in stone. Recent scholarship in Cistercian studies have begun to examine the architecture of the entire monastery, not just the abbey church itself. As historian Thomas Cummins has noted, Cistercian abbeys were much more than church buildings. They were entire villages, an enclosed economy and society. These enclosed villages were scattered across Europe. Cistercian communities extended from Scandinavia to Spain, from Ireland to Hungary. And recent scholars have resisted what previously was seen as a cookie-cutter approach that merely repeated the same layout of each monastery. Instead, the collected work of architecture and hydrology and topographical studies have revealed remarkably adaptable plans. Cistercians had strict criteria even for the locations of their abbeys. They were typically in valleys and required a water source around which the abbey layout would be designed. The water would enter the abbey nearest the kitchen, then continuing through the monastery to run mills, fill ponds for fish farms, and finally, before passing outside the monastery, would flow underneath the latrines. The entire layout of the monastery was adapted to the particular needs of the abbey, but there was a unity in the design that conformed to the natural reality in which it was placed. Most importantly, the abbeys were embedded in their particular place, designed around and according to reality and the limitations that nature itself provides. A Cistercian architectural mindset cannot simply be recovered whole cloth. Had they had the technological power of the modern day, it is quite likely their design would be much more like our own Augustinian architectural plannings, but perhaps not. Perhaps the magnifying power of technology would only enhance their monuments of applied theology. It is the extent of my presentation. I wanted to make another move into the way of redemption, but unfortunately I figured that wouldn't have time for that. So instead, I'll just leave it there, and very excited for a conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Gilbrian. Go ahead and unmute anyone if you'd like to ask a question or drop it in the chat. I can start us off again. Or did someone else just unmute? Sorry.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Hello. This is Brother William from Hong Kong. I'm a
Hello.
Franciscan. Hello.
Excellent.
It's midnight now, so I won't turn on my camera. I'm sorry. Okay. As a Franciscan, I see similarity of Duns Scotus concept of Hesietas be akin to the theology of particularity. Can you speak a bit about Franciscans?
Yes,
theologians?
I would love to, although unfortunately, I think you're far more an expert in Franciscan theology than I am. But that's right, and I think especially you see it in Franciscan reflections, but really at any Christian theology that starts to enter towards an incarnational reflection begins to look especially at that question about particularity and what it means to be embodied. And so I'm more familiar with the biological side of that as opposed to the Franciscan reflection, but even contemporary biotechnology reflections that have to grapple with embodiedness, I think, have that question of particularity in play.
Mm-hmm. Well, because when you talk about particularity, I was thinking about the thisness, and Hasietas is more like, because this house or this place is fundamentally different from that place, although it have the same ecological condition, but because this is with the cultural or whatever social roots to it. So I would, because the particulars sounds more modern, so it may have a appeal. And my second question, actually, I'm also a landscape architect, and I'm really interested to see how somebody is researching on Cistercian architecture. Would you say a bit on how because what I see interesting as from a religious point of view, how God, when during creation or the creation narrative, God creates a garden, and then how in the Revelation we have this new heaven and earth, the new city, New Jerusalem. It's interesting how it's almost like the city sort of overrides, sort of is the triumph of redemption. I don't know. So can you speak about on this from a typological point of view, how the garden becomes a city, please? Yes.
Right. And so you see especially that reflection on the garden and the recovery of the garden actually even in church design itself. So there's an interesting interaction between functionality and then symbol in Christian architecture, especially even the pillars that you would find in a Gothic church were planned in they're symmetrical in the sort of reflection of a perfected garden. They resemble trunks of trees. I think you see it most vividly in Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, actually, this notion of this natural world. But then you also have the point not just back to the garden, but to a perfected reality. And so you'll often see on the ceilings, if there are some, occasionally you'll see things like stars, but they're not stars designed like constellations. They're actually all ordered and in line because it's the perfected order that's being anticipated in, as you said, the New Jerusalem, the new garden, which is here present in this church. And so there's been a lot of research, especially around the construction and the design of Cistercian abbeys, but more recently, they've been looking at this broader sense of the entire abbey as looking at this new society, this perfect society, and the ways in which that actually functions beyond just the church itself.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good luck to your research.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, I'm a student of theology and urban community development in Toronto, and we do some work. Or one of the areas that I'm interested in is Indigenous reconciliation and environment and theology. And I'm basing this question off of the Anglican Cathedral in Nunavut, which is shaped like an igloo.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, and so I'm wondering if you can maybe comment a little bit about how architecture and reconciliation maybe could go hand in hand.
Yes, and I don't know as well the context in Canada, but I do know I've spent some time in East Africa, and it's actually quite interesting to see the way in which there's actually a bit of a tension in the way in which people imagine their sacred spaces. It tends to be missionaries from the West who really want to see things like the tabernacle in a Catholic church, which is up by the altar and has the Blessed Sacrament within it. Western missionaries tend to want that tabernacle to look like African dwellings, traditional African dwellings, whereas the African priests I know really want to have what looks more like a Western style of this tabernacle. So it reveals, I think, the tension at play in how we imagine these spaces. But that idea of making sacred space, like encultured sacred space, I think is consistent throughout the Christian tradition. And the idea to have a universal style, I think, is dangerous. So I'm not as familiar with the reconciliation movement, but I think that notion is another side to what often comes up in terms of, even in clergy, of representation in clergy. Well, representation in architecture also seems to be a necessary way for the reality of a community to be enfleshed.
Go ahead, Mitch.
Thanks for your talk. I was really curious about what you were going to say about redemption.
Yeah.
And so here's your chance.
Right. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. So the trouble becomes focusing too much on the idea of the unadulterated natural world, and the idea that as close as we can get back is better, which removes human agency and the idea that we do work in the world. So there's this really quite fascinating theologian, Sergei Bulgakov, who prior to becoming an Orthodox priest in the Russian church was actually a Marxist economist. And he writes a really fascinating work called Philosophy of Economy, where he has an expansive notion of economy, which describes economy is simply the term for the relationship between humanity and the natural world. But what he talks about is that through humanity's participation and in co-creation, humanity elevates the natural world beyond what naturally it would be. So there's the semblance of elevated grace. And so he describes that humanity becomes co-redeemers. He does use the word transcendence, but not necessarily in the sense of abandoning the material, but transcending what was and elevating it to what would be beyond. And so this notion, even when we look at buildings, it is a means in which we change the natural world. It's not just left in this pristine state, but how we go about doing that can either be an elevation of what is into what is more, or a sort of more Francis Bacon approach of just conforming it into whatever we desire it to be. And one of those, I think, actually the first looks more at the goodness of what is, trying to elevate the goodness, and the other is just that Augustinian sense of conforming it, making reality that what we wish.
Great, and I think we have a chance for one more brief question if anyone has a quick one. I was curious, I love this place-based idea in the architecture. I wonder if you see a idea that this could be applied to an urban context where the place is now so human-centered, it might be hard to recover the way it originally was.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think there are aspects, especially of the new urbanist movement, that do seem to grapple with that in an inspiring way, that both make spaces that are human spaces, but also that aren't as ubiquitous as so many downtown metropolises that are identical. You wouldn't even know you're in a different country if GPS didn't say as much. But that notion of particularity, I think, also becomes clear in an entire urban design. It's why we love visiting, I think, old towns that are known as themselves. I always think, especially, I have a great love of New Orleans, and so it's just distinctly itself. It can't be anything other than it is, and you can't confuse it with something else. So that notion of a place becoming itself, I think, is something I want to think more on. As you can tell, it's not completely developed, but I like the idea a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gilbrian.